go ahead. It's 6:30. My van route tonight was an hour and 13 minutes long.
Whoa.
Kids spread out all over the place.
You had to make 2 trips or just one?
Well, I could have made one because there was one from the trailer park.
Really?
And I usually have 6 or 7,
where,
you know?
Where was everybody?
I don't know.
Sometimes they'll walk, too.
Yeah, well, they didn't walk. I don't know what they're doing tonight. Well, there's a couple that were dropped off by somebody else, but anyway, it's worth it. I keep telling myself it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to make y'all look at me. I'm not that vain. I'm trying to get this.
We complained because we had to drive through Walker to get here, and you was in the van for an hour trying to.
I had to go down Buddy Ellis Road today,
Yeah, they got those apartments.
which is like a war zone. You got to dodge people because they're not paying attention, and the road's only as wide enough.
Still working on it.
Yeah.
And they got all those new apartments.
All
down
that
there.
new building up and down there. And then I came back through to go to Brown Road to cut through back to get some kids on Joe May. And that old swampy area that used to be there, used to be a gravel road not too long ago. Man, they got all that cleared out and fixing I know they're just going to dump houses in there like that.
Yeah.
And they got that one little old road to get in and out on. Joe May and then the other end.
Mm-hmm.
John L. Lane.
And we have a planning commission. Did y'all know that? They don't know what planning commission means, but we have one. I mean, I don't know how you could ever get that high enough to build, really. I mean, every time it rains, the road gets water on it and stands on it. What they'll do. I'm sure they're planning, though.
I'm worried about what this new subdivision they're building up across from the little elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
That new subdivision.
You see how high they put that on those houses?
Because it's all up and it's all going to run down to the ones, right across from Sportsman Crossing. Those 2 subdivisions are going to catch all their water.
That's exactly right. The elevation's about 18 inches higher, so a whole 1.5 feet higher than what they did when they built South Haven.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot. Yep. But we have a planning commission. They've got it all figured out.
Surveying.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of surveying.
I don't know what they're surveying for. Maybe flood.
They surveying to put in more houses.
Probably.
They're surveying all the way down.
This is how it works. You create the problem, and it becomes a problem. Then you go ask the federal government to fix the problem, because they're not going to spend the money up front to do it the right way.
Yeah.
All right, we're in chapter 4 of Ezra, and so we get to this spot. It really doesn't give us a timeline unless you go back and look at the timeline of the kings, and you realize that 16 years has passed since the time that they got to Jerusalem and began to survey the foundation and what they needed to do. And they got the foundation right, and they built the altar for worship, and that's as far as they got. Okay? And so at the beginning of the book, we understand that God had directed the king to send them back to build a temple to the Lord. I mean, that's the whole premise for them being there. And they got started and then they didn't finish. Okay? So we look at this sometimes and we say, well, they were under so much opposition by the people that had moved in that they just couldn't get it done. And that could have been part of it, but part of it was they got back and they began to settle their own towns, and they kind of lost interest in building the temple. They were more interested in getting their own lives back in order. And then the other thing that existed which is we find out a little bit in this chapter, is the people that had been transplanted into the land. They had been there now, some of them for as long as 60 years. So the Jews are coming back, and they're claiming their old ancestral land, which creates a conflict.
Yeah.
So if the impetus for being there is to build the temple, then it becomes politically astute, and for these people that are there, well, if we can keep them from building the temple, maybe they'll leave. Maybe this won't become a problem. Of course, it does become a problem. And it's not well, as we move along, we'll find out that Ezra directs the people to do some things that God never directs them to do. Okay? So, in a very short period of time, they've moved away from this idea that we're going to establish a temple of worship to the Lord, and He's the one that we're going to serve, and He's the one that we're going to take our direction from, just like the old days. And they begin to do some things on their own that cause a great heartache and great trouble. And so as we move along, we'll look at some of those things. One of them being divorce. They just demanded that the Jews divorce what they considered to be half-breed or pagan people that had come in. And if you've ever read Malachi, and it speaks of how God hates divorce, He's actually talking about those divorces. And we take that, we use that passage sometimes out of the context for which it's meant. To do damage to another, to divorce is what God hates. So we'll look at some of those things as we move along through it. So it says, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building the temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the family heads and said to them, let us build with you, for we also worship your God and have been sacrificing to Him since the time King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here. This is a long time ago. If the Assyrian king had brought them there, then that means that these particular people had settled in the northern kingdom. Okay, they were the first to go into exile, and that exile had been undertaken by the Assyrian king. So that tells us a lot about who these people are. They've been there a long time, and it also says that they are the enemies of those that are from Judah. This could be left over from the old divided kingdom days that had just kind of become instilled. The people in the north don't like the people in the south, and so there was that kind of conflict. Could be what I mentioned earlier. The Israelites are moving back in, and they feel threatened about losing the land that they've now been on for over 70 years. And also, there's kind of this thing where they begin to talk about, we worship your God too. And they may have been worshiping Yahweh along with any other god that may have been a part of their culture. Okay, so the old idol worship had moved in with these people that had been transplanted in, and then Yahweh worship was still hanging on by the people of the land that had been left, and it had all kind of blended together. Okay, the same syncretism that had caused problems during the days of the king was still there. Okay.
Well, these people here just wanted to sabotage the whole thing.
They were not wanting the people to settle, and so it's kind of like keep your friends close and your enemies closer. If we can get in and keep them from building the temple, then they will have failed. And then two things could have happened. They could have left in shame, or the king that sent them there to do this could withdraw them. He was still in control. Okay? So anyway, what we find is that after 16 years, there's hardly been anything done. And then as they begin to do a little bit of work, there's this constant opposition. and the walls keep getting pulled over. It's just a mess. Okay, and we're going to look at that from a theological standpoint in a little bit when we get more toward the end of the passage. So he says, "Let us build with you, for we also worship your God and have been sacrificing to him since the days that we got here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the other heads of Israel's families answered them, "You may have no part with us." What part with you would be with us? It's kind of a saying that says, we don't want to have anything to do with you. Okay? Since we alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. So now they're kind of leaning on the political reason why they're there. The king had sent them to build this temple, and he sent them to do it, not y'all. So we don't want your help, and we don't want anything to do with you. All right? So these are people that have been on the land now for 80 or, well, at least 100 years, really. All right. Then the people who were already in the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. That word discouraged is, I don't know, you may have a note, says that what they were doing is it means to weaken the hands. It means they were trying to take the air out of their balloon. They were trying to find every reason in the world to convince them not to do what they had been sent to do. And the other, it says, and made them afraid. This idea of being afraid to build, it's what's normally described of a people that is under the threat of a military advance. So the making them afraid, they're making the kind of threats that would be made in a war. Okay, if you continue with this, we're going to attack, we're going to kill you, we're going to do whatever. You know, we're going to lay siege to you. Whatever the idea may have been, it was meant to make them afraid. Then it said they also bribed officials to act against them to frustrate their plans throughout the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. So Cyrus sends them. He sends them well equipped. They've got leadership. They've got money. They've got everything they need. But they met resistance the whole time, and for 16 years, nothing gets done. They got the altar, and that's it. But you don't really even hear about worship beyond the first or the middle part of chapter 3 until this problem with the opposition is finally solved. All right. A lot is said about this passage when it's preached on, about how God sends us to do a thing, and then when opposition arises, we tend to go weak in the hands, like it says, and we just don't do what we're called to do. And that is true a lot of times. The work that we feel like God has given us to do just seems to be too much for who we are. Now, you remember, they have everything they need to purchase what they need. They've been told. Cyrus has told every governor of every province to provide them with what they need. The problem that they're having is they just don't have the will to follow through. Okay, and the motivation should have been purely one of, we're going to serve God. But it had been a long time. They had managed to do the best they could in the synagogues while they were in exile. They had Jeremiah had encouraged them to have families and build houses and plant your crops and kind of settle in, because you're going to be here a while. And all of that kind of watered down their zeal for God. And so now they're trying to ramp all this back up at the same time. And they're back in the land that had been promised to them, to their father Abraham and it's occupied by other people, and so they're just flat discouraged, and they've got to get past it. So, at the beginning of the reign of, and there's a different word for Darius, okay, Ahasuerus, the people who were already in the land, these are the ones that had been transplanted in, wrote an accusation against the residents of Judah and Jerusalem. During the time of King Artaxerxes of Persia, okay, so we had Darius, and now we got an Artaxerxes. There's 3 Artaxerxes. There's a lot of conversation and commentaries about if all of this information is presented chronologically. Some believe that it's not, that it's presented out of order but for effect. We're not going to pay attention to any of those things. We're going to read it and take it in the chronological way that it's here, because it's really minute differences. It's not a whole lot there. But during the time of King Artaxerxes, and this is probably the first of Persia, these 3 and the rest of his colleagues wrote to King Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. So the language of the people was Aramaic, and it had to be translated into what the Persians would read and speak. So Rahum, the chief deputy, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter to King Artaxerxes concerning Jerusalem as follows. From Rahum, the chief deputy, Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of their colleagues, the judges and the magistrates from Tripolis, Persia, Erech, Babylon, Susa, that is the people of Elam, and the rest of the peoples whom the great and illustrious, I can't say it, deported and settled in these cities of Samaria. This was the Assyrian king, okay? Deported and settled in these cities of Samaria and the regions west of the Euphrates River, or it's a euphemism, across the river. So he's speaking of when you cross the Euphrates River, you enter into the Indo-Syrian area, and that whole area is what he's talking about. So everything from what we know to be the northern kingdom in Samaria all the way up to the Euphrates River down to the border with Judah. So these are the people that are writing this letter, that have been there now for some 100 years. This is the text of the letter they sent to him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men from the region west of the Euphrates River. Let it be known to the king that the Jews, this is the first time they're called that, I think, from the word Judah. Let it be known that the Jews who came from you have returned to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and evil city, finishing its walls and repairing its foundations. Let it now be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt and its walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, duty, or land tax, and the royal revenue will suffer. So, since they have taken an oath of loyalty, or since we have taken an oath of loyalty to the king, and it is not right for us to witness his dishonor, we have sent to inform the king that a search should be made in your father's record books. In these record books, you will discover and verify that the city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces. There have been revolts in it since ancient times. That is why this city was destroyed. We advise the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are finished, you will not have any possession west of the Euphrates. All right, so that's a pretty good letter, right? They don't want this temple built. They don't want Jerusalem built. They know that once it is, It will become the powerhouse in the region, and they really won't have a leg to stand on. The Persian kings don't rule with an iron fist. They set up governors to rule. The governors that rule pretty much are determined by the peace and productivity that is allowed in the land, much like Rome did. Later, Rome would set up provinces with governors, and as long as it was peaceful and as long as people paid their taxes, they really didn't care what else happened. And this is the same kind of thing. Well, the argument that's being made is, look back in the records and you will see that these people in this city was nothing but trouble until actually the king Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, came and finally conquered it. So, and it's true, right? From Lord, the last 8 or 9 kings, outside of a few, well, not even Josiah. Josiah was a part of a rebellion at the end of his reign. Hezekiah was a part of a rebellion at the end of his reign. So it seemed like every time the kings would come into power in Judah, they were constantly rebelling against Assyria or Egypt or whoever was in charge at the time. And so all of this had been written down, especially from the time of the Assyrians forward, because they were meticulous in their record keeping. I don't know if I mentioned, but they just found a dig, or they found some artifacts in a dig, and it's a library that was just a depository of information for one of these kings. It's got like 36,000 the little tablets are about this big, and they would write on them front and back, and they were numbered. They had a number on them, and they had this very sophisticated number system where they would all be together in the library, and to read the whole account, you knew how to go find. It's like a Dewey Decimal System. You knew where to go first, and then you could read the whole thing. And it was just this. It's huge. And what else was interesting about it was they found this one, and they had already found another library like it. But in both libraries, the tiles had been broken. Some of them had been broken. But they were so accurate between the two locations, they could take the two together and put them together and come up with what they were saying. Anyway, I thought it was fascinating. That's how meticulous they were about keeping a history. Yeah. So look it up and see they're a problem. And if you allow this to happen, your kingdom's going to suffer. Is basically what they're telling them. So that's what he does. Artaxerxes says the king sent a reply to his chief deputy Rehum, Shimshai, and the scribes and the rest of their colleagues living in Samaria and elsewhere, and said, "Greetings. The letter you sent us has been translated and read in my presence. I issued a decree, and a search was conducted. It was discovered that this city has had uprisings against kings since ancient times, and there have been rebellions and revolts in it. Powerful kings have also ruled over Jerusalem and exercised authority over the whole region west of the Euphrates, and tribute duty and land tax were paid to them. Therefore, issue an order for these men to stop, so that this city will not be rebuilt until a further decree has been pronounced by me. See that you not neglect this matter, otherwise the damage will increase and the royal interest will suffer." So what he's saying is, stop this mess, because I don't need anybody rebelling. Everything's fine right now. I'm getting my taxes. There's no problems. And if this is going to cause a problem, we're just shutting it down. Okay? Go back to Ezra 1. God's the one that initiated all of this. Okay? And yet there's all this interference that keeps showing up. God never really interferes when we look through this whole thing. Okay? this is there's a series of events that play out in Ezra and Nehemiah and even Esther, which is sandwiched in between this story, that God kind of lets play out. And so we're left with trying to figure out what's the point, what's God up to, you know. And I think when we look at the whole volume together, we can begin to get an idea. So, verse 23, as soon as the text of King Artaxerxes' letter was read to these guys and their colleagues, they immediately went to the Jews in Jerusalem and forcibly stopped them. Josephus says that they tore down everything they'd already built. That's how they forcibly stopped them. Okay, so they went in, that took some effort, but they were able to bring a halt to what was going on. So now the construction of God's house in Jerusalem had stopped and remained at a standstill until the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. So this is a long time. This is the 16 years that I mentioned earlier. They just quit, you know, and for good reason. They didn't have the support of the king anymore. They had went with the support of Cyrus. Artaxerxes says, no, we're not doing this. And so they didn't have the support that they needed to do it, and they kind of just went on their way. It says that, but when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, what is it? I don't know how to say it. That's close. And Jeshua, son of Jozadak, began to rebuild God's house in Jerusalem. So Haggai and Zechariah show up on the scene, and they want to know what in the world's going on. And Haggai gets right to the point. You're building your own houses, and the foundation for the Lord's house is idle. There's nothing there. And he kind of throws it back on them. You weren't sent here by God or anyone to build your house. You were sent here by God to build his house. Okay, so what's the purpose of that? Proper worship. To have a life with God, there's got to be proper worship. And so that's the 30,000 foot view that we're always that hangs over this thing. This is about properly honoring God with their life. So one of the things that gets twisted around in that is that they begin to develop an idea that carries forward, is that you've got to, in some sort of way, have it all together, be purified before you can worship. And everything about temple worship was to come to be purified so that you could be with God. So this attitude about you got to get yourself straight first before you can come is where a lot of what Ezra orders done comes from. And a lot of what Malachi and some of the other minor prophets do to correct that is what we have in their writings. So they stop listening to those who are opposing, and they're listening to God's prophets. So they begin. And it says the prophets of God were helping them, were with them, helping them. So these prophets, and maybe others, they got in on the act too. So everybody has been encouraged and is now working toward building the temple back. At that time, Tatene, the governor of the region west of the Euphrates River, I'm not even going to say that guy's name, rebuild this temple and finish this structure. Let me scroll down here. And So he says, who gave you the order to rebuild this temple and finish the structure? And they also asked them, what are the names of the workers who are constructing this building? But God, it's just a passive presence of God. He's there. And the writer, if you recall when we were going through 1st and 2nd Samuel, this happens a lot, where activity's going on, and then all of a sudden the readers are reminded he's still present, and he hasn't forgot about what's going on. It says, but God was watching over the Jewish leaders. These men wouldn't stop them until a report was sent to Darius so that they could receive written instructions in this matter. All right? So God is watching over them. They're carrying on under his text. So, this is the text of the letter that the governor of the region west of the Euphrates, this is what they sent to Darius. It says, King Darius, let it be known to the king that we went to the house of the great God in the province of Judah. It is being done diligently and succeeding through the people's efforts. So we questioned the elders and asked, who gave you the order to rebuild this temple and finish this structure? Okay, so they show up and they see that progress is actually being made this time. The description is much more descriptive than the previous one. Columns are being set, stones are on one on the other, cedar beams are going up. This project's well underway, and then they asked the question, who told you to do this? We also asked them their names, so that we can. There's another reason why I want this done, because I want these people praying for me. So somewhere along the way, he had experienced with these Hebrew people that were in exile in his land, that they were living by prayer. Because what else did they have? See? So he's recognized this, and he says, I want this because I want them to pray for me and my sons. Okay?
And he doesn't want the consequences of them not praying. I think it's more what the reputation is.
Yeah.
Because when God got upset with these kings, bad things happened.
Bad things happened. See, yeah, you have to imagine, what all did he find when he searched those records? What did he find?
That guy came to Cyrus, probably.
Yeah.
The guy came to Cyrus and told him to let them do that.
Let them do that. And these libraries that were around could have very well held copies of the Chronicles. They were already written. We know that they were written before. They were actually all a part of this. But
that's what I was going to say. He probably found how many kings came before it, didn't listen, and what happened.
yeah. So we just don't know the whole story, but we do know that he is quite interested in having the God of the heavens be prayed to on behalf of the king and his sons. So, although we can look at this as a reoccupation and all that kind of thing, from both ends of the spectrum now, we have God's people stating publicly and loudly that we're servants of God. And then we have at the other end a king that is saying, yes, and I want those servants praying for me. I want this to succeed, not only for the glory of God, but for my own glory. Okay? And God doesn't strike him dead for that. God uses that. A whole other lesson in the background of this thing. We can be as arrogant as we want to, and even narcissistic, and if God chooses to use it, he'll use it to accomplish what he wants, which ultimately is the reestablishment of life together with his people. All right, so the governor and his colleagues diligently carried out what King Darius had decreed. So the Jewish elders continued successfully with the building under the prophesying of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished the building according to the command of God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. This house was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius. So, let's see, when did they get started again?
First year from Cyrus.
Let's see, they were... I've lost... till the 2nd year of the reign of King Darius, and they finish it in, what did it say, the 6th year?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So 4 years they've been under this construction project. Then the Israelites, including the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles. So remember, the priests and the Levites came with Zerubbabel at the very beginning, and they had spread out, and they had kind of settled in their own towns. They had gathered back up into Jerusalem for the initial worship when they had dedicated the altar, and that's the last time we hear about worship. So we don't know if it went on or if they went back to their towns and worship at the altar, just kind of stalled for a while. But anyway, here they are with them and the rest of the exiles, meaning the rest of those that had returned from Babylon. Celebrated the dedication of the house of God with great joy. For the dedication of God's house, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, and 400 lambs, as well as 12 male goats as a sin offering for all Israel. So we have here this great celebration offering, and then the 12 male goats obviously are for the 12 tribes, okay, to cover their sins, each one from an Israelite tribe. They also appointed the priests by their divisions and the Levites by their groups to the service of God in Jerusalem, according to what was written in the book of Moses. So they're doing things by the book. The exiles observed Passover on the 14th day of the first month. All of the priests and the Levites were ceremonially clean because they had purified themselves. They killed the Passover lamb for themselves, their priestly brothers, and all the exiles. The Israelites who had returned from exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the uncleanness of the Gentiles in the land, in order to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. All right, so there's that statement. Those that had separated themselves from the transplanted ones, the ones that were actually exiles but just moved to their land. So they're, what we have here is a racial division, okay? The Jews and then everybody else. And if you were not a Jew, you were not going to be allowed to worship. So remember, it previously said, oh yeah, we worship the God there in Jerusalem. And but not only him, we worship other gods too. So the division is something that's going to create a problem later, because some of these folks were married to these Gentiles and had been for a very long time, probably from generation to generation. So now what's happening is that family units are being busted up. And we're going to look at that later and see just exactly how that comes about and if it was the right thing to do. Then it says, they observed the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days with joy, because the Lord had made them joyful, having changed the Assyrian king's attitude toward them, so that he supported them in the work on the house of the God of Israel. That's interesting. He calls him an Assyrian king. when he's a Persian king. But what's going on there is they're kind of carrying back to all this started under an Assyrian king, and the effects of that has just been carried over through these other conquering kings. All right. After these events, during the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, and some believe this is the second Artaxerxes, Ezra, and it gives Ezra's bloodline here, okay, takes him all the way down to being a son of Aaron, okay? So Aaron was the first priest. And so this Ezra has a bloodline of a priest. So he arrives, or Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. So a scribe was like a lawyer, like it's used in the New Testament when it talks about scribes and Pharisees. If someone had a question about what a law meant or what the scriptures meant, you went and found a scribe, because they devoted their whole life to studying this stuff. And the religious leaders of the day in the New Testament were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they would debate the meaning of Scripture quite often, and they relied upon the scribes to kind of help them along the way, because they knew it better than anybody. So that's what he was. He studied. He just studied this stuff. The king had granted him everything he requested, because the hand of the Lord, his God, was on him. Some of the Israelite priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants accompanied him to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Ezra, so this is a good time later. In fact, stop. Oh, I'm trying to find.
My Bible says 60 years.
60? Yeah. Yeah, I printed this thing thinking it would help, but it doesn't help much. Yeah, it's been a while since between chapter 6 and chapter 7. So they came up from Babylon. He was, we already read that part. So some of the Israelite priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers came with him in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month during the 7th year of the king. He began the journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month, okay, and arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month. So it's a good little journey, about 4 or 5 months. Since the gracious hand of God was on him. Now Ezra had determined in his heart to study the law of the Lord, obey it, and teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. So here we have a purpose statement that's given for Ezra. His heart's desire was to study the law and to obey it and to teach it. Pretty good. Okay? That's what we're all called to do. We're to study the law, obey it, and then help other people understand what it means. Okay? So Ezra becomes significant because not everybody that has returned understands the law. They're going through this, but they're needing some instruction. So it keeps talking about the hand of God being with him and the God guiding him. That's the whole reason for his returning, is the people need some direction. This is the text of the letter King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest and scribe, an expert in matters of the Lord's commands and statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, an expert in the law of God of the heavens. Greetings. I issue a decree that any of the Israelites in my kingdom, including their priests and Levites, who want to go to Jerusalem may go with you. So this is the second return. It's been the first return that happened so many years ago. And then this is the second one that is being allowed. You were sent by the king and his 7 counselors to evaluate Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your possession. You are also to bring the silver and gold the king has and his counselors have willingly given to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem, and all the silver and gold you received throughout the province of Babylon, together with the freewill offerings given by the people and the priest to the house of their God in Jerusalem. Then you are to be diligent to buy with this money bulls, rams, lambs, along with their grain and drink offerings, and offer them on the altar at the house of your God in Jerusalem. You may do whatever seems best to you and your brothers with the rest of the silver and gold, according to the will of your God. So Artaxerxes really is in tune with this whole business with God. And he's allowing Ezra to exercise completely the will of God as he goes back to, or as he arrives in Jerusalem. Probably never been there. Deliver to the God of Jerusalem all the articles given to you for the service of the house of your God. You may use the royal treasury to pay for anything else needed for the house of your God. I, King Artaxerxes, issue a decree to all the treasurers in the region west of the Euphrates. So he's basically telling everybody, the governors west of the Euphrates, you give them whatever they want to complete this worship of God, okay, at the temple. So I'm going to skip down to verses 25. And you, Ezra, according to God's wisdom that you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to judge all the people in the region west of the Euphrates who know the laws of your God, and to teach anyone who does not know them. Anyone who does not keep the law of your God and the law of the king, let the appropriate judgment be executed against him, whether death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put it into the king's mind to glorify the house of the Lord of Jerusalem, of the Lord in Jerusalem, and who has shown favor to me before the king, his counselors, and all his powerful officers. So I took courage because I was strengthened by the hand of the Lord my God, and I gathered Israelite leaders to return with me. So it's interesting. You get to this point, all of this is written in third person and a repeat of a letter, and then all at once in verse 27, it breaks into first person. Ezra is speaking directly to us. And so that gives strong evidence that he wrote at least this point forward that we'll look at. But this is good. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who has put it into the king's mind to glorify the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. So the temple is, once again, it's going to be the focal point. Everything that's going to happen, it is certainly the focal point for King Artaxerxes, okay?
But he's giving God the credit.
He's giving God the credit. And also, not only is the temple the focal point, but we're discovering too that the law is that the king either has been exposed to it or has seen it at work in some sort of way, and he is picked up on the value of it. Because not only does he want the people to go back, build the temple, worship there, and renew the law for themselves, he's talking about everyone west of the Euphrates River. Okay? A lot of Gentile people. A lot of people that are not Jewish. Okay? He wants them to know the law too. He wants them to have an understanding of the God of the heavens too. All right? So much of what God has already said that he's going to bring worship to the Gentiles It's happening in all these various ways, and this is one of those ways where they begin to develop a love for and a respect for and a worship of God. In fact, because those Samaritans, they came to be called, were so mistreated by the Judeans in Jerusalem, they decided they would set up their own temple in Gerizim to worship, because they weren't allowed to worship in Jerusalem. Okay, so the division that had caused so much problems through the divided kingdom was just being repeated. But it wasn't over idolatry. It was over really the idolatry of the race, getting past that problem. See, is this making sense? So the Samaritans that we hear about in the New Testament that are hated so much, it goes back to this. This is where it all began. Okay, where this great division began, and in fact, some of what was going on already in the northern, we'll look at it. The prophets talk about it more than this account does, but there's already an effort to build another temple in the north that is thwarted through this process. Okay. So when I read this, and you kind of carry it into contemporary times today, the problems we create around race is still, it's still almost when they talk about it being America's original sin. Well, if it wasn't for the story of Adam and Eve, this would be the original sin in the Bible. It's been a problem, ever since the beginning. And this just kind of amplifies it some more as we move through and begin to see it. But for now, Ezra says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who has made all this come to pass," that we just looked at. And then he says, "He took courage because I was strengthened by the hand of the Lord my God, and I gathered Israelite leaders to return to me." So earlier, there was the weakening of the hand. Remember when they were being opposed? Now you got the opposite going on. My hand was strengthened by God. I was weakened by my opponents, but my hand is being strengthened by God. And so that's the literary contrast there. And by doing that, he had courage. Okay. Seemed like we covered a lot. We did. It's 3 chapters we blew through. And so much of it's letters. Then it has this list. The second return, those returning with Ezra. These are the family heads and the genealogical records of those who returned with me from Babylon during the reign of King Artaxerxes, and it gives all the list. Let's see if there's any names that are going to jump out later. Not really. He says, "So I gathered them at the river that flows to Ahava." Okay. You remember Havilah in Genesis that flowed from the garden? It was one of the rivers. You had the Tigris, Euphrates, the Havilah, or flowed through to Havilah. Anyway, commentators think this is the same river. They just got the letters mixed up. So I gathered them at the river that flows to Ahava, and we camped there for 3 days. I searched among the people and priests, but found no Levite there. Then I summoned the leaders, and he summons all these people. I sent them to Iddo, the leader at Cassiopeia, with a message for him and his brothers, the temple servants at Cassiopeia, that they should bring us ministers for the house of our God. Since the gracious hand of our God was on us, they brought us, this guy, a man of insight from the descendants of Mali, a descendant of Levi, son of Israel, along with his sons and brothers, 18 men, plus Hashabiah, along with Jesiah. I love these names, and they all have meanings. From the descendants of Merari and his brothers and their sons, 20 men. There were also 220 of the temple servants who had been appointed by David and the leaders for the work of the Levites. All were identified by name. So Ezra's not sure what he's going to find when he gets there. Okay, remember there was priests and Levites and all these others that went already, but he's not sure that they're functioning, that they even know what to do. So he's making sure that he's got his own temple servants and priests and Levites to come with him. So he's coming prepared. He's not going on this and later have to say to God, yes, I did this, but I wasn't really prepared. I messed up. So he's thinking ahead, and he's prepared himself for this. Okay. So I proclaimed a fast by the Ahava River, so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask him for a safe journey for us, our dependents, and our possessions. So you really begin to see a shift in everything, right? When the holy man shows up on the scene, the focus completely changes. You got all this stuff going on where it's the kings that are the focus. They're making the decisions. They're determining that there's going to be success, and all this wealth is just poured at it. And, nothing can go wrong. But Ezra's already shown the kings can't provide God's servants to the temple. There's not money that can create a priest or a Levite or a gatekeeper. I've got to find those people. I've got to find the ones that God has already ordained for this so that it's right. So we see an entire shift of thinking by Ezra away from it being centered on the kings, and now it's all being centered on what God's doing. And so the next thing, in order to prepare to leave, they fast. Okay? What was the purpose of a fast? We talk about fasting today, and we usually center it around some problem that we're needing an answer for, and it's a way to focus and that sort of thing. So, same thing. A fast for them was to say, my body does not depend on the food that I provided. My body depends on the hand of the Lord that is protecting it and guiding it. So that's basically what it was. The other thing that it did, if you've ever fasted, and I did it once, I don't know why I never did it again, but I fasted one time. I did the full 30 days. I was a younger man then. And there is something that begins to happen with your body, mind, and soul together at that point, where there's a union that I don't experience. I don't experience, and we don't experience when we don't do that. So anyway, this was a 3-day fast. This was a way to say to God, we're not relying upon ourselves, we're relying upon you. So they're asking for a safe journey. I did this because I was ashamed to ask the king for infantry and cavalry to protect us from enemies during the journey, since we had told him, the hand of our God is gracious to all who seek him, but his fierce anger is against all who will abandon him. So what else is going on here? He asked for God to protect him. Why? Because he had already said we don't need soldiers. we got God with us. And then he thought, I better fast for 3 days just to let God know that we're serious about this. We don't want to get out in the, crossing this land for the next 4 months and have to deal with these marauders that are going to come after us. And so we fasted and pleaded with God about all this, and he was receptive to our prayer. Then he goes on. I selected 12 of the leading priests, along with Sherebiah and Hashabiah, and 10 of their brothers. I weighed out to them the silver, the gold, and the articles, the contribution for the house of our God, that the king, his counselors, his leaders, and all the Israelites who were present had offered. I weighed it out to them 24 tons of silver. That's a lot. Silver articles weighing 7,500 pounds. 7,500 pounds of gold. 20 gold bowls worth 1,000 gold coins. And 2 articles of fine gleaming bronze as valuable as gold. Then I said to them, you are holy to the Lord, and the articles are holy. The silver, the gold are a free will offering to the Lord God of your fathers. Guard them carefully until you weigh them out in the chambers of the Lord's house before the leading priests, Levites, and heads of Israelite families in Jerusalem. So the priests and Levites took charge of the silver, gold, and the articles that had been weighed out to them to bring to the house of our God in Israel. Now this just adds to the whole idea of trusting in God and not an army. I mean, you just look at the wealth that is there to be had by whoever would want to come take it. That's a lot of stuff. And yet they were going to trust God to take care of it for them. Which is, we get all nervous about the stuff that we have, right? There's such a little bit of it. We think that there's just such a little bit. We live in this scarce economy, and now if you turn on the news for 3 minutes, all you're going to hear about is inflation. Your dollar's worth 10% less than it was last year. Really, buying power is less than that, and blah, blah, blah. Here we go. And Ezra here, and just entrust it all to God. Just trust it all to God, and he's not going to lose any of it. And so we can do the same thing, but be prudent. He wasn't reckless with what they had. He weighed it out to them, and he told them to protect it. And when you get to where you're going, make sure it gets in the right hands. It wasn't like he was reckless about it because God was in control. He was quite prudent. And we can learn that same lesson and be the same way. So is all of this making any sense to you? Does it all... you look like you're bored a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. That had to be pretty obvious as they were going through there what they had.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
they couldn't keep that secret. If somebody if somebody dared to take that from God,
yeah,
they had to know it was there.
So 24 tons is 48,000 pounds. That's just about a semi-load full of silver alone. So just moving that with ox carts. You've got a caravan that's miles long, vulnerable, no soldiers, no cavalrymen, nobody to ride back and forth to make sure that everything's okay. Just God, and everything got to its place and the way that God wanted it to. So that up until Ezra, things are kind of stop and go. The goals that have been put forth and the edicts that have been put forth and the reasons why they were doing everything were kind of lost in the haze, and they kept reaching this opposition, and things would stop as long as 16 years before it would start again. And then it's another 60 years before Ezra finally comes on the scene, and then Nehemiah is after him. So this is a long process that God's under. It's kind of like he's the exile was over. He said it would last 70 years, but now we're already beyond a 70-year period just trying to get back and having everything established the way that it's supposed to be. And so you begin to wonder, why does God operate in these ways where things just have to be, they seem to be just drawn out to finally accomplish what he wants to accomplish? I mean, we certainly feel that way ourselves sometimes, right? But this is just taking God way too long. This is not a big deal for him.
Well, it looks like they were procrastinating, not God.
Okay, good point. So in a lot of this, they were letting the distractions and the procrastination and their own self-interest and that kind of thing get in the way of what was going on. All right? We don't know how quickly things may have happened if they would have just asked the people that had all the power. There's just a lot about it that God says, okay, I've got as long as I need, and you're the ones that's got to come around to my way of thinking. Well, then Ezra comes on the scene, and he does. He has come around to God's way of thinking, but how did it happen? He took the law of Moses and he studied it, and he just studied it, and he studied it, and he applied it to his life, so that when Ezra spoke, those that knew him, they had confidence because they'd already seen it in him. He studied it, he obeyed it, became a part of his life, and then he was teaching it. And so that is what God needed on the scene. This is the first one that shows up like this. And so we wonder, why does it take God so long? Well, maybe he's waiting on us to get in his word, to live it, and be free with it, is what it's basically saying there. Is once you've studied it and it's become a part of your life, it can only be free flowing. There's no way to bottle it up. It's like Paul says, I would just burst if I weren't preaching. There's no way to bottle this up in me. Jeremiah said the same thing, and that comes from a love of Scripture. And then once God has that person in place, or you in place, living like that, then he makes these great strides that we see happening here when we get to the rest of this later. There's these great strides that occur with him, because now our life is prepared for just about anything that he wants to pour into us. So there's Ezra, and he's kind of like the model priest that's going on here. And then in these when we get to the prophets, we'll see prophets that were working at this time, and they weren't experts in the law, but God just pours into them the words to speak. So their hearts were ready and willing too, for an entirely different purpose. So God needed prophets. He needed prophets that would stand before the people and challenge them with the will of God and the word of God, so that they would begin to get moving. And he also needed the ones that had studied and spent a lifetime studying and applying the word of God and Scripture, so that it could be free-flowing to people. So both are needed. In our day-to-day, we need prophets. We need people that'll stand and just speak what God's put on their heart. And we look at those folks sometimes, and we're not so sure about them. And some of them are, some people that claim to be a prophet, you kind of got to watch out for. I don't think a prophet would ever have to say, "Hey, I'm a prophet." You know what I mean? That would never be required of them if God is just pouring through them and it's pouring out. So we need those people today, and especially in the climate that we're in today. And then we need people that truly they've digested this word to where it's just a part of who they are, and everything that comes out is tempered by it and made by it. And we see both going on here. And so what we will find as we move through is, on a rare occasion from the rest of Ezra and into Nehemiah, the kings are a second thought to what's going on. Everything that's going on is centered on God. And some mistakes are made, and that's okay too. God overcomes those too. So that's another lesson that we learn, through all of this, is we can be doing our very best and be doing what we're called and made to do, and still not get it just right. But God can still use it. We're still vessels of clay. All righty. Y'all got anything on your heart we need to pray about? I know we got your cousin, right? That we want to pray for.